Hi everyone, Michelle here from michellesmidheaven.com. And today I'm going to take a look at Laurie Bembenek's chart. I always love studying people's stories alongside their natal chart so that I can see the unique way in which unique individuals live their life and how they make decisions, how they cope with setbacks, and what they learn through experience as well. And but also the concrete events, right? The concrete events that happen in life. And I'm definitely captivated by the story that I'm sharing with you today. And I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about an ancient Hellenistic technique called like-engirding. So I'll get to that in a minute, and I'll briefly look at some solar return charts as well. And I'll talk a little bit about contra-antiscia and the lunar nodes. So there's a lot I want to cover today. Well, let me first start by saying something about Laurie Bembenek, whose name is probably not very familiar. Her name was actually Laurencia, but she changed it later into Laurie. So that's the name I'll use from now on. And she was convicted for murdering her husband's ex-wife. But decades after the facts, DNA and ballistic testing proved her innocence. Unfortunately, she never saw her name cleared, and there was never any further investigation to find out who actually did commit the murder. And I was struck by the incredible misfortune Laurie had to deal with in her life, and it goes further than the prison sentence. I'll talk about that too, but first let me pull up the chart for you. All right, at first glance, we see quite a nice nighttime chart because the sun is below the horizon with a new moon in Leo. And then we see a pretty good first house ruler, Mercury in Virgo, which is a sign of its domicile and its exaltation. And the first house ruler is important here because it's the planet that describes the native. Mercury describes Laurie's character, and apparently she had that typical curiosity and skillfulness we associate with Mercury. She was said to be very inquisitive, very intelligent and articulate. And this well-dignified Mercury is in the fourth house of parents and home. And Laurie had a very happy childhood, but early on she was also showing her outspoken mercurial side, asking critical questions, and she was a little rebellious too, speaking up about certain things that might rub people the wrong way. There's a new moon in Leo in the third house, and the third house is a house that has a lot to do with the mind. The moon is said to be in her joy there because the moon's significations overlap with the third house. So this moon speaks to the way in which Laurie's mind works. So the third house is where we gather and process information. And as you can see, that new moon is closely connected to a conscientious, high-principled Jupiter in Libra through a sextile aspect. Is the first aspect that the moon is making. So Jupiter will play an important role for Laurie. And I imagine her to have found her pride and purpose in doing what she thinks is the right thing, because that's what's on her mind, we could say. Jupiter in Libra is concerned with doing what's right and is always weighing the pros and cons and then making a judgment about it. And this has a lot to do with the rulership that Saturn has over Libra. In the Hellenistic tradition, Saturn is the exaltation ruler of Libra, and Saturn has a divisive nature and is interested in opposing viewpoints so that Saturn can help us separate the chaff from the wheat. So Jupiter in Libra actually takes on some of that Saturnian adversity in a sense because it's partially ruled by Saturn. Saturn is the exaltation ruler. And you'll notice that Saturn, in turn, is located in Jupiter's sign, Sagittarius. So Jupiter has Saturn as his guest, And that means that there's some mixed mutual reception going on between Jupiter and Saturn. Anyway, I don't want to make things too complicated. I'll just illustrate this with an example. At one point, Laurie challenged a priest at her Catholic school who she thought was taking an inappropriate interest in her and her 12-year-old classmates. So she confronted him. Laurie just had to speak up about it, and the priest completely lost his temper. And her parents wanted to pull her out of school after that incident, but Laurie wanted to stay because she felt she'd be admitting she'd done something wrong while she didn't. And later in life, she wrote in her book that that was the first powerful lesson in independence she learned, and a lesson in, trying to do the right thing and the consequences of trying to do that. And just on a side note, why would Jupiter in Libra be important for Laurie's values and character? Well, her first house ruler, Mercury, the signifier of her character, is retrograde, and it's applying to make a contra-antiscia or mirror point to Jupiter. And that's connecting both planets, Jupiter and Mercury, through a hidden aspect where otherwise they cannot see one another through any of the traditional aspects because they're in signs that are adjacent. And we're also going to keep in mind for later that contra-antiscia are very similar to oppositions. So there's something secretive about Jupiter that is somehow working against Laurie's best interests. Now, let's take a closer look at Laurie's natal Saturn for a minute. As you can see, it's located near the point of the descendant in the 7th house. That's the exact point where the planets disappear below the horizon. Now, the 7th house is, of course, opposite from the 1st house, which in traditional astrology represents the native. That means that the opposite 7th house signifies other people in the broadest sense of the word. In the 7th house, we find random strangers as well as marriage partners and also enemies. Think of how a partner can turn into an enemy. It's all happening right there in the 7th house. And here we have Saturn sitting on the descendant, which is a sensitive point. When a planet is conjoining a sensitive point, it tends to be amplified and plays a prominent role in the person's life. In other words, Saturn is really demanding our attention here, and we know that Saturn is often said to be the most challenging planet in a nighttime chart. So if you have a nighttime chart, check out where Saturn is. And the topics of the house Saturn is located in may be the ones you tend to struggle with the most. Saturn is, of course, the god of adversaries. So having Saturn in the 7th house can be seen as a warning sign. Watch out for the people that cross your path. They're not always going to be nice people. On the other side of the spectrum, in the best case scenario, Saturn in the 7th can mean that the native may marry later in life, for example, or they get into an exceptionally long relationship. Just to say that there are several possibilities depending on the rest of the chart. So to those of you with Saturn in the 7th house, don't panic. But here, this prominently placed Saturn in Sagittarius, which is ruled by clerical Jupiter, the god of priests. Laurie's first adversary shows up in the disguise of a priest, and unfortunately, it won't be her last encounter with Saturn. Now I'd like to gradually move us into the Hellenistic technique I wanted to talk about today, and I think a good way to approach this is through Laurie's career choices. We can find out what jobs will come along in a person's life in various places in the chart. Usually the 10th house of activities in the public sphere will speak to that. Oftentimes the sun speaks to a person's vocation as well. And of course, also the second house, which indicates, in a more practical sense, perhaps, how we make money. Now, with Venus in the second house and as the exaltation ruler of Pisces in the 10th house, it's not surprising that Laurie started working as a model, but she knew that, that wasn't what she wanted to pursue as a serious career. She earned an associate degree in fashion merchandising management, but she definitely also had an interest in politics. For example, she supported feminist groups and she joined a protest demanding the Milwaukee Police Department to establish a sexual assault unit. She was inspired as well by the TV show Charlie's Angels, the original version from the late 70s, I think it was, that showed 3 independent crime-fighting women, and Laurie found that to be very inspiring, and she decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. She took it very seriously, and she got in shape for the police academy, and she could actually run very fast, by the way, which is also one of Mercury's significations. And around the time that she made this decision, there were eclipses happening in her 10th house of career. So that clearly indicated a change of direction, and she shifted from being a model and having an interest in fashion to becoming a police officer. Now, again, we can see how Venus, the goddess of beauty, speaks to her being a model, but what does this have to do with her desire to work in law enforcement? Well, here's where we can take into account some of the other clues in the chart. We see that Jupiter is ruling the 10th house of career, and we already know that Jupiter happens to be in Venus's sign Libra. So Jupiter is definitely connected to both the career and making money. And in the Hellenistic tradition, Jupiter is the planet of law and order. But there's more to it than that. Usually when we think of law enforcement, the police or the military or anything that has to do with crime and violence, we can associate that with Mars, the warrior god. Now, how does Mars come into play here? Well, Mars happens to be connected to Venus because it resides in Venus's sign, Taurus, but maybe surprisingly, Mars is also connected to Jupiter through a technique called like-engirding. Like-engirding is a technique you'll sometimes see referred to as agreeing in the belt or agreeing in the journey or like zone. And this simply means that there's a natural affinity between the signs that are ruled by the same planets. That's it. The planets and the signs that are ruled by the same planet fall into certain houses, and they will tend to work together. Capricorn and Aquarius are both ruled by Saturn, so Saturn connects the topics of the houses Capricorn and Aquarius fall into. Jupiter connects the houses that Sagittarius and Pisces fall into. Planets in Aries and Scorpio are connected to one another through Mars. The topics that Taurus and Libra represent in the chart are connected through Venus. And finally, planets in Gemini and Virgo cooperate through their domicile ruler, Mercury. Now, Mercury signs Gemini and Virgo on the one hand, and Jupiter signs Sagittarius and Pisces on the other, are already connected through traditional square aspects. So when we have a planet in Gemini and we have another planet in Virgo, they're going to be connected anyway through a whole sign square aspect. So thinking of like-engirding connecting these signs is a little redundant here. It really makes no difference. The same goes for Jupiter's signs. Planets in Sagittarius will automatically be connected to planets in Pisces through a whole sign square. So adding like-engirding seems redundant. Although we could say that because of the like-engirding, the square aspect, which is a more challenging type of aspect, tends to soften a little, simply because it's easier for these planets to cooperate as they share the same ruler. Like-engirding becomes much more interesting when we look at the other sign pairings. Why? Well, because you'll notice that the other sign pairings cannot see one another through one of the traditional whole sign aspects, such as a sextile, square, trine, or opposition. Planets in these pairings never connect through any of the traditional aspects. They're said to be in aversion to one another. But thanks to the technique of like-engirding, planets in Taurus will cooperate with planets in Libra and vice versa, because they're both ruled by Venus. The same goes for Mars's signs, Aries and Scorpio. Planets in those signs cannot see one another, but they'll work together anyway. And then finally, the same goes for planets in the adjacent signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. Their topics and the planets located in those signs will work together for good or for bad. We can have good friends and bad friends, right? Now, getting back to Laurie's chart, we know that Mars and Jupiter are going to join forces. Mars is in Venus's sign, and it's ready to fight there for the greater good, so to speak, as Mars is a little less self-centered, you could say, in Taurus, and more focused on others. Combined with Jupiter in the scales of justice, we see how that speaks to Laurie's ambition, but we also need to keep in mind that Mars will bring in some 12th house trouble, such as secret enemies and sorrow, self-undoing. I'll just give one example to illustrate that 12th house dynamic. While Laurie was still training at the Milwaukee Police Academy, an anonymous tipster reported that Laurie was seen smoking pot at a party, and they couldn't prove anything, and Laurie had a good idea of who that might have been, somebody who was jealous. But anyway, nothing came of it. But in May of that same year, she stuck up for a friend who was accused of something, and that eventually got her fired later that year. And we can see this in her solar return chart for that time. A solar return chart, for those who don't know, is a representation of the planetary locations in the sky. In other words, the transits in the sky at the time when the sun returns to the exact degree it's at in the natal chart. So this is always around the native's birthday, and it's a great tool, the solar return chart, that is going to tell us which themes are likely to get activated during the coming year, so until the next birthday. Here you can see that Mars is located in an angular house, the first house, which is the most important house of the chart. So we know that Mars is going to have something important to say this year. And it's in Cancer, where Mars is said to be in its fall. Now we know that whatever Mars is coming up with, it won't be easy. We see that Mars rules the 10th house of the solar return chart. Aries is in the 10th house, pointing to Laurie's career, her social status, and reputation. So Mars brings 12th house topics, as promised in the natal chart, into her career and reputation house. And this is also personal, right? So Mars is in the first house here. So you see how we go back and forth a little between the natal and the solar return chart to find out which topics will be important this year. After she got fired, Laurie discovered photos of drunk police officers dancing naked on picnic tables in a local park, which I'm sure must have been infuriating because they went completely unpunished, while Laurie noticed that female and minority trainees often were punished or even fired for minor infractions. She took the photos to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they recommended filing a discrimination report with the MPD's Internal Affairs Division. She spiraled into a depression because she couldn't find a decent job, and when transiting Pluto came within 3 degrees of her natal 7th house ruler, Jupiter, in the 5th house, Laurie got involved with Fred Schultz. If we only wanted to take the traditional planets into account, by the way, we could look at the great conjunction that was happening between Jupiter and Saturn in her 5th house of pleasure and romance right around that time. That would have activated Jupiter as well. At that time, she was unaware of the fact that Fred was one of those nude police officers that was in the photos she had sent to the Internal Affairs Department. This is another interesting example, right, of how that hidden aspect between her helm ruler Mercury and the ruler of the 7th house of partners, Jupiter, is playing out here, with Jupiter, again, of course, connected with Mars through like-engirding. If Jupiter gets activated by a transit, that's what a transiting planet making an aspect to a natal planet does. It's going to set in motion something that is described by that planet. So if Jupiter gets activated by a transit, as was the case here, then the 7th house of relationships gets activated because Jupiter is ruling that house together with the 10th house that Jupiter is also ruling. 5th house topics get activated because that's where Jupiter is located. But also natal Mercury is set in motion here because it's in a contra-antiscia to Jupiter. And Mars is set in motion as well through the like-engirding. Fred had just divorced his wife, Christine, and 2 months after he met Laurie, they got married. I want to take a look at the solar return chart for that year because it's quite a crucial year for Laurie. She was 22 years old when she met Fred and got married, and we can see that this relationship is front and center of her life this year because her 7th house ruler, Jupiter, lands in the most important house of the solar return chart, the 1st house, together with Saturn here in a very prominent position, very close to the horizon line. And we know that Saturn in the natal chart is in her 7th house of relationships. You'll notice that in this solar return chart as well, Jupiter rules the 7th house of marriage and Saturn rules the 5th house of romance. So that means we already have a double emphasis on relationships, which indicates that this theme is definitely coming up for her this year. This is how we detect important patterns when making predictions. We need to see what stands out. Is this going to be an overall positive experience? Well, let's look at the quality or the essential dignity of the planets. Saturn has no dignity at 25 degrees Virgo, and Jupiter is in its detriment in Virgo, which is not great at all. And we need to consider the natal promise of Jupiter. In the natal chart, Jupiter is closely conjoining the North Node, and things are not always what they seem when they're close, when a planet is close to one of the nodes. Venus, the natural significator of relationships, on the other hand, is doing quite well. So far, we have a mix of auspicious and ominous signs. In her autobiography, Laurie mentioned that she was drawn by Fred's overwhelming personality, that he was a little manipulative and consuming, but he was also the life of the party, and he really allowed her to forget her depression for a while. However, A red flag for me would be the fact that the moon is about to form a contra-antiscia to Saturn. The moon is also the traditional signifier of marriage. So the condition of the moon here is something I'd be concerned about, because a contra-antiscia speaks to something hidden that is also working against her best interest. The moon is also co-present with the debilitated malefic Mars. And Mars is very strong here since it's connected to the degree of the MC. So again, this is a sensitive point that will amplify Mars in this case. And it's likely to express its 12th house promise, especially since Mars also happens to be the Lord of the year by profection. I won't go into that today, but the moon is always the best indicator of the general winds of fortune. She's going to give us some clues about whether good luck is on our side or not. Laurie's first house ruler, Mercury, is located in the threatening 12th house of the solar return chart, accompanied by the sun, which has just been eclipsed. So a solar eclipse tends to bring significant changes on a person's life path. And in the 12th house, those changes may be very challenging, having to do with self-undoing, hidden enemies, loss, separation, isolation. And the 12th house is a place where it's often hard to make progress. Not always, but oftentimes. Well, it turned out the honeymoon days ended very quickly for them. Money got very tight because Fred had to pay the monthly mortgage for his ex-wife's house, along with child support for their 2 kids. We can see the debilitated Mars and the moon's contra-antiscia to Saturn point to that, because the moon and Mars are in the 2nd house of money. And about 4 months into their marriage, Fred's ex-wife, Christine, got murdered in her home. The perpetrator was seen by Christine's 11-year-old son, and he said he saw a masked male figure. And this is what he told the police. It's also what he said in court. Despite this testimony and many other considerations that I won't cover here, Laurie was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder. And even when the verdict happened a year later, we can see the foreshadowing of that event happening here. Long story short, Laurie goes to prison. 8 years later, she escapes prison with the help of her cellmate's brother. They live in Canada for a couple of months until somebody recognizes her and alerts the authorities. Now, she's still trying to prove her innocence, but that doesn't work out. But because the trial had been such a mess, she gets out on probation a couple of years later. I actually get more into this in an article I wrote for Astrum Opus. Just search for Astrum Opus on Substack if you're interested. I've got another solar return example for you over there. I won't get into it now because I think it will take too long. The last thing I will mention is this. Jupiter in the 5th house is often associated with exuberance. And here with the North Node, Jupiter might dole out some good fortune, of course, as we would expect from a benefic planet. But the North Node often gives us something, only to take it away again later. Jupiter, god of freedom in general, and here in this chart as a ruler of the 2nd house, speaks to this guy, Dominic, helping her escape prison, only to get her arrested again after a couple of months. Jupiter, as a 2nd house exaltation ruler from the 5th house of pleasure, on the other hand, speaks to her excessive intake of alcohol. While it is true that she liked to party when she was young, later, as a consequence of her experiences in prison, she suffered from PTSD. And when she was released from prison, she became a heavy drinker in an attempt to forget her pain. Jupiter signifies the liver disease that would eventually get her killed at age 52. Okay, another example of the same dynamic. Jupiter with the North Node in the house of creativity here. Well, Laurie was passionate about painting, and her artwork was even put on display at a local art gallery at one point. But again, the North Node gives and then takes away. A freak fire destroyed all her paintings and burned the entire building to the ground. Remember, the like-engirding is at play here between Jupiter and that fire starter Mars in the 12th house of loss. And then in 2002, Dr. Phil was willing to do a DNA test to help her prove her innocence. Dr. Phil's handlers, however, wouldn't let her leave the room for a long time, and Laurie experienced a severe panic attack because of that. She tried to escape through the window, and she broke her foot so badly that the entire part of her leg below the knee had to be amputated. I've got another example of that nodal association with amputations at our Astrozine Astromopus on Substack in my article on Terry Fox, if you'd like to check that out. Finally, DNA testing in 2003 and then a ballistics test in 2008, 2 years before Laurie died. Those tests disproved Laurie's involvement in the murder case. Yet Laurie's appeal to clear her name, as I said at the beginning, was denied, which means there will be no further investigation and, unfortunately, no justice for Christine Schultz. Okay, I realize that I crammed in a lot of different techniques in this chart example, and that's because I teach these techniques. I offer private tutoring to anyone who wants to be able to analyze charts like this. So check out my website, michellesmidheaven.com, for that if you're interested. But I also want to clarify that when I do chart readings for clients, I don't get into the technical details. Well, not unless somebody asks, of course. A reading is very different. It's more like a consultation where interaction is very important, of course. And my goal is always to bring clarity about psychological patterns. And I try to adapt the entire conversation to what I see in the chart, because every chart is unique. And if you're interested in getting a reading with me, I hope so. Please get in touch. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.